Are we facing anything new in the Gran design, as far as you know, than what we faced in his previous book, A Brief History of Time?
There's nothing new scientifically in this book, nothing new about the origin of the universe or about the fine-tuning of the universe. Mm-hmm. Nothing new in that respect, as I anticipated. But what is new, Greg, in this book that I had not expected is that the first third of this book is devoted to a purely philosophical discussion of anti-realism about the world. Mm-hmm. It is a radically postmodernist view of reality that Hocking and Mlodinow lay out in the first third of this book. And this is so ironic because on the first page of the book, they say philosophy is dead.
I know.
These are questions that were traditional philosophically answered, but now we will answer them as scientists.
I thought...
And then they launch into this discussion of this postmodernist anti-realism. It's bizarre.
I know. I saw that, and it's the first line of the second paragraph, and I thought, what a shot to fire over the bow right at the beginning, and it just struck me, and I hope this doesn't sound condescending, but it struck me as hubris and ignorance for them to make such a statement, especially given what follows in the next couple of chapters, which is there's a little bit of history of science in there, but with philosophers, Aristotle and Descartes and some of the others, and I thought, what do they think they're doing here? You know, with this opening salvo and then going into the first third of the book like this.
You know, you're absolutely right about the arrogance and condescension that such a statement represents, because they have succeeded in insulting every member of the Department of Philosophy at Cambridge University, where Hocking teaches. Right. And this includes people like Michael Redhead, D.H. Mellor, and other very eminent philosophers of science. Mm-hmm. And they're saying these men haven't kept abreast of the field. And I just wonder, well, what in the world have these men, have Hocking and Mlodinow read that would allow them to make a statement that arrogant, that condescending?
Well, you know what it reminds me of, Bill, is it makes me think of an 8-year-old who is looking at his parents, and he's saying, I don't need you anymore. I'm going to run away and make it on my own. I tried that when I was 8 years old, by the way, and I know you can't get very far. And by the same token, he's acting like science doesn't need philosophy when science is a stepchild of philosophy.
Yes, and the book itself bears testimony to that fact. They cannot escape philosophy in doing this book themselves. And so what they wind up doing is amateurish, bad philosophy.
Well, was it Einstein who said scientists are poor philosophers?
Yeah, it was. Albert Einstein made that comment. The man of science is a poor philosopher.
Yeah, and this book is an example of this. And we don't mean at all, I mean, it's... we're starting out this conversation here kind of gasping at how bad it's the book itself starts out, and we don't mean to just be hurling epithets to just diminish them and move on. It's because here I'm speaking, friends, with a man of philosophy himself who knows these issues inside and out, and I've got a little clue on some of these things. And as we look at the opening salvos and the opening discussion, we see immediately how woefully inadequate the foundation for this book is right out of the gate before we even get to the quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's another issue, the quantum mechanics. Let me just offer a question about this, because I do want to get back to the philosophy in a few minutes, because I think there's some serious, maybe what might be called external conceptual problems in the way they set this up, the quantum mechanics and their scientific determinism. But, you know, I think that a lot of folks are just intimidated by the quantum mechanics label, and it's almost like we have our ideas and we've thought them through, and then somebody kind of says quantum mechanics, and all the rest of us have to lay down and surrender, you know, because, quantum mechanics has spoken. And I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to read this and say, or not even read it, just know what Stephen Hawking's view is and say, Stephen Hawking says it, I believe it, that settles it, because quantum mechanics is king.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a kind of intimidation factor that the professional scientist can use to silence debate. And I think what the layperson needs to understand is that although the mathematical core of quantum physics, that is to say subatomic physics, the mathematical equations are highly confirmed, well established, but there are at least 10 different physical interpretations of what those equations mean, and nobody knows which of those interpretations is correct. And Hawking and Milodinoff never mention this fact. They just pick one of those interpretations and run with it, and they never bother to mention the fact that nobody really knows if this is the correct interpretation of these equations.
Yeah, well, some of those guys kind of jokingly say that nobody even knows what quantum mechanics itself means. Now, that's got to be an overstatement, but I think it's meant to show how much uncertainty, shall we say indeterminism, there might be with regards to the field itself.
Right. What we need to understand is that the scientific theory is composed of two components. There's the mathematical core. Those are the equations. And then there's the physical interpretation of the equations. And it is the mathematics of quantum mechanics that are well established, well confirmed. But the physical interpretation is, as you say, so obscure that someone like Richard Feynman said nobody really understands quantum physics.
Yeah, and he's a player.
Yeah, exactly. And he's referring there to the physical interpretation. He doesn't mean nobody can do the equations or that it's too hard or anything, but that we don't really understand what the correct physical interpretation of these is.
Bill, could you cash that out for us, our listeners, a little bit? I mean, I think that some of them are thinking, well, okay, what's the difference between an equation that seems reliable and a physical interpretation of the equation?
Right. Well, let me just give an example of this. In quantum mechanics, there is an element of indeterminacy, that is to say, unpredictability. And one of the major interpretive disputes is, does this mean that reality itself is indeterminate, that reality itself behaves in non-deterministic ways?
Random ways.
Or,
kind of.
Yeah, randomly, if you will, within certain probability bounds, but nevertheless it's not determined. Or does this reflect simply an uncertainty in our knowledge of the way the world is? And those are two radically different interpretations. On the one hand, it would say that reality itself is somehow indeterminate. On the other hand, it would say, no, reality is fully determinate, but we can never know reality with certainty with respect to certain of these properties, like the exact speed and position of a subatomic
Sure, that's
particle.
Heisenberg. You know, I've always been troubled by this. By the way, this issue came up last hour with a caller and determinism and whether we're talking about epistemic indeterminism, your point that you can't know it, as opposed to more ontic, that the thing is random in itself. And it strikes me that, and this was and I don't know what I'd be interested to hear what you had to say about this, Bill, but my understanding of Heisenberg, who the uncertainty principle there is if you measure one thing and it affects the other thing, and so you can only measure one at a time, but you can't get both measurements accurate at the time, that this was clearly epistemological, that is just a difficulty in knowing at any given point in time these details, but it didn't mean that the things themselves were not determinate, that they weren't following a certain pattern because of the nature of things. And it seems to me that people have taken this epistemic notion or difficulty and they've blown it into a huge, metaphysical principle that nothing can be known and we create reality when we measure it and these kinds of things. Is that a misstep?
Yeah. Well, what you've actually described there is about three different of these physical interpretations that I was referring to. One physical interpretation would be that indeterminacy is ontic. Another one would be, no, reality is deterministic, but the indeterminacy is epistemic. A third interpretation would be this observer-created reality, that by our observations we actually create the way the world is. And as I say, these are all empirically equivalent. You can't decide among those three based on scientific consideration.
In other words, the evidence...
They all make the same predictions.
Yeah, the evidence, when you say empirically equivalent, the evidence that we have equally supports each explanation.
Yeah, they're all equally consistent. They all make the same predictions. And so, at least to date, you can't decide empirically which of these physical interpretations is correct.
Okay, so on the one hand, when we hear the quantum mechanics kind of salvo fired against, say theists of some sort, that we ought not be intimidated by that, because oftentimes people are misusing the quantum mechanics as if there was an established, accepted way of understanding this that there's no debate about, and that we've moved forward in our understanding about the nature of the universe as a result of quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's right, Greg. And any elementary book, a popular level book that would introduce you to the quantum world or the quantum realm, will talk about these different physical interpretations, and we'll say in the end that nobody really knows which one of these, if any, is correct. And so when people base grand philosophical or theological conclusions on these interpretations, it's very easy to simply respond, well, you know, there are at least 9 other ways of looking at this, and there's no reason to think that your view is the correct one.
Do you think Stephen Hawking is actually trading on a particular understanding of how quantum mechanics cashes itself out in order to make his case for the universe self-creating? And we'll get into some detail about what he means by that. But do you think that...
I don't think that his use of quantum mechanics and a particular interpretation of that is so critical in the origin of the universe, frankly. I think it comes into play more when he wants to get rid of the fine-tuning or explain away the fine-tuning by generating many worlds. And one of the interpretations, or actually there are a few, of quantum mechanics would be a many worlds interpretation.
I see.
And he appeals to a particular many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics to generate a plurality of universes, and thereby to multiply your probabilistic resources for getting our finely tuned universe by chance.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the hour, because that is there are 2 main arguments that have played a role in defending theism recently: the cosmological argument, which you have been such an important contributor to, which Hawking takes exception with, and then the teleological argument, design argument. We hear about the Discovery Institute, and Hawking has a different strategy for going after that. We'll get to that shortly, those 2 things, but I want to go to the philosophy for just a moment that he presents in the beginning of the book, and I wondered if you could speak to this. He says, this is Stephen Hawking, says that he is a scientific determinist. That's the principle that scientific laws determine everything in the future and everything that happened in the past. And he applies, and I don't know why he adds scientific to determinism, because it seems to me like determinism is just determinism, you know. But he applies this to human nature too. So there is only one kind of causation in his view, and that's event causation. There is no agency, certainly not of God, but not of human beings as well. And what stuns me is that on this view, then, if physics is everything, then physics would have to determine the order of the words in his own book.
That's right.
And not the laws of discursive reasoning and inference and logic and the kind of thing. So what does that make of his entire argument? That's
what I wondered as I read this passage in the book. I thought, what confidence can they have that anything they have written in this book is true, since on their view they were just determined to write it? It's like water gushing from a pipe or a branch growing out of a tree. They were just determined to write these things. So what confidence can they have that what they say is true? And in particular, what confidence can they have that their affirmation of determinism is true? Right. It undercuts itself.
Yeah, and as I read, I've just read up to the goldfish bowl
that's
chapter.
Anti-realism again.
Yeah, and we'll get to that too. But just as he lays down his foundation and then his assertion of scientific determinism, I did not get the sense that he has the slightest inkling of the difficulty that he has with the views he's just laid, and the hole that he's digging for himself.
I'm sure you're right about that. I think it's very naive philosophically. But here's a further question I had, Greg. How do you square his affirmation